In today's episode, we are featuring mental health advocate Lorraine, who has been focused on bringing more awareness to mental health for the past 2 years in Shanghai. Inspired by her own turbulent experience of trauma and struggles with mental health, her ensuing battle with an eating disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, her mission is now geared towards greater mental health. Her path towards recovery came with tribulations, which led her to build a health and wellness platform called Inward Living, where she hopes to open pathways for others experiencing mental health struggles to seek help in a way that is free of the stigma and shame that we often feel as a society around such topics. Lorraine Lee, welcome to Multispective.
So, Lorraine Lee, can we start from the beginning? What was your childhood like? Where did you grow up?
Thanks for having me again. And I do hope that, by, I think, sharing today, that we are able to, be relatable with some people that might be listening. And I think what you guys are doing is really amazing. But I think where did I grow up? I grew up in Melbourne. I was born in Tasmania, which is a small island in Australia, but me and my family moved to Melbourne when I think I was about 4 or 5. So I spent pretty much most life there. Moved to Hong Kong when I was about 25 and I've kind of just been here since. So
what was your relationship like with your family growing up?
My family, my dad and my mom moved from China when they were around in their 20s. I think my dad was around 30 as well. So they were kind of, I guess, the first generation from my family to go to Australia. My childhood, I always have the, memories of my childhood kind of, being a really happy one. So, I always felt, very loved. My parents were very hardworking. So I think when they went to Australia, they didn't really have that much. But they set a really good example of, working really hard and building, I think, quite an amazing life that they do have now. I think definitely my relationship was good. I think in the sense of, I was quite obedient, I think, when I was and, parents were quite traditional in that sense that there were very traditional expectations. So do well in school, go to university, which is, I think, the same story for a lot of people. But definitely I think when I get a bit older, it was definitely a bit turbulent through my teens, and after I kind of started to go to university as well. So it was a little bit choppy. I think being a teenager, you're kind of trying to find your own boundaries, find your own limits, and I think I've always had quite a, I guess, strong sense of not necessarily what I want to do, but kind of wanting to go in my own direction, I guess. So definitely that was definitely not always kind of in line with what my parents wanted.
Did you feel like there was a bit of a cultural clash or difference in the sense that you were raised in a very westernized kind of culture and you had traditional parents? What did that do for your identity and for your self kind of development?
I think definitely. I grew up, I guess, without any real experience of having lived in China. And I think, with any family that comes from a different culture, when you're living in a country like Australia, which is so Western, and such an opposite environment that China was, to, I guess, relate to a lot of things. but when I was young, I kind of always knew, or the messaging my parent knew was that, like this is how you're supposed to behave. You have to be like polite and considerate. You listen to people who are older than you. So whether that be your grandparents or, just aunts and uncles, your mum and dad, you definitely don't speak back to or anything. But, when I was young, there wasn't that, or the schools I went to, there weren't that many kind of Chinese kids around. So my personality was definitely just, I don't know, it just grew kind of from my environment, which was quite Western and, quite free-willed and, fun-spirited and free. And, so I think in terms of like for my identity, I was always, I guess I felt very like one, or I felt very Australian, if that's the word. And I mean, when you're young, I think so much about your identity is feeling like you fit in, feeling like you're not like the odd one out. So I think the Chinese side of me was definitely one that was more, as part of my family, but it didn't feel like it reflected that much of who I was. So it's definitely something that I've come to appreciate a lot more as I've gotten older, which I didn't always have an appreciation for at a younger age.
So you said that you had some turbulent times as a teen. Was it because you were trying to rebel against your parents' wishes, or what was this turbulent times during your teens?
It's a good question. I think it's puberty. I think you just have a lot of hormones happening. So I really liked socializing, and I was always really outgoing. So I always kind of wanted to be with my friends. I was an only child as well. So, I always kind of felt like, that my family was my friends essentially. And I just loved spending time like outside of home. My parents, who are great people, but I think it's changed a little bit now, but they were never people who were open about their emotions, or, people who kind of spoke outside of the box or the rule book of things that you could say. So, I think because what was normal for them, I guess, was to, raise a child who, was academically maybe strong and who wasn't too wild, I think is a word that always kind of comes, didn't go out all the time, was very focused on academics, didn't like to stay out late at night, no dating kind of before you graduate from high school. Whereas I think, I going out, and I loved kind of hanging out with friends, and, during school holidays, I was kind of like every opportunity I could to go out. I remember, there was a phase where I was like jumping out of my window in the middle of the night, and, I wasn't doing anything dodgy or scary, but, I was just hanging out. We'd just go to a friend's house and hang out with friends. But, I remember I would kind of like lock the door, climb out the window, and one day I came back and the window was shut and my door was wide open, and then I just sat outside my house for 3 hours, like knowing that my parents were kind of waiting for me there, and that like, the wrath of hell was going to come down on me. But so I mean, I feel like these days, I think feel like a lot of these actions are things that are quite normal to, I think, just like development. But I think for them, it was just something so foreign. And for them, it was really, they just thought that it was like the end of the world, or that I was off kind of like doing drugs, or like the worst thing you can imagine. So yeah, it was difficult for them.
It must be difficult, like being an only child, because I have 7 siblings and I have a big family. So like, if I didn't do well, they'll just put it on my younger brother, or like, they have like a trial and error thing. But with you, you're the only candidate.
Yeah.
So I guess, was there a lot of pressure on you as a teen with your parents?
I think my parents were, they had high expectations. So a lot, I think it was very one-dimensional. So a lot of the expectations for me while I was a teenager and in school, it was kind of like, if you get good grades and, you get into university, then you can kind of not do whatever you want, but we're not going to be like watching you, strictly. So, I mean, a lot of friends who also had similar, families to me of backgrounds who definitely, their parents were a lot stricter. But I think like my mum, I think getting older, I've learned, my mum has kind of been through a lot in her life. My dad also struggled with a few things. So they used to kind of like fight quite a lot, and there was a little pressure on me. I mean, I remember young them kind of almost getting divorced quite a few times, but there was a sense of, we can't get divorced because we have a child and we have a family and, that's just not what you do in our culture. So, from a young age, I was always kind of given this notion that, if you weren't here, we wouldn't be together, so I think in some ways, my mum kind of put all her focus on me and, the way that I behaved or the way I acted was kind of, there was this pressure of either I was like completely, making everything worthwhile, for her and making her proud, making my parents proud, or just, completely kind of failing. So, I remember kind of finding that really overwhelming. And, sometimes, like I said, I just wanted to go out. But I think for my mum, sometimes she would kind of read into these things as it meaning that I was, falling off the rails or something. So I definitely always, I didn't always feel like I was able to kind of have my own voice. So I think I knew very well, like how to make my mum happy, how to make my parents happy, but it was always kind of fighting with this side of me, which was very, free-spirited and didn't want to be, kind of locked up in a cage and wanted to go and try all kinds of like weird stuff, like or just like be outrageous and spontaneous. So I think there was definitely a lot of times where I felt like a failure. I felt like I was letting her down or disappointing her, or in comparison, I think, to other children or family friends, I felt like Lorraine a little bit wild, or Lorraine's she's got a bit of a weird streak, and I am weird, so it all kind of makes sense now as well.
You're the good kind of weird.
Do you feel like there is a part of you that still holds on to that kind of pressure in a way, maybe to like still be the good daughter to your parents and like meet their needs? Or was there a point where you were able to sort of like let that go and say, okay, I'm going to start looking for my happiness and what I want?
Yeah, I think more importantly, just a lot of work in terms of self-discovery and, understanding, a lot of the difficult experiences that I've kind of been through, in the later part, I think, of my adolescence or my early kind of adulthood. So I carried that pressure, I think, all the way until I was probably 30 years old, which is, only 4 years ago. So I always kind of like had this very strong sense, or for my parents, as a girl, it was, you get married. So it used to be as a teenager, you get into university, you really do very well. And then as soon as I kind of graduated from that, then it turned into like, you need to find like a partner needs to meet this criteria. They need to have a university degree. They need to have a very stable job. So, you need to kind of get engaged and get married. So I think like that then became the new set of expectations that really stuck with me, and I really kind of internalized that and internalized, I think a lot of the messaging, I guess, of what it meant to be not a successful woman, but a woman, And yeah, so I think nowadays I don't, because I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit later, but yeah, I think I just hit rock bottom. So, as difficult as that was, it's been such a blessing in, to rebuild my life over the last, 3 years, putting a brick in place at each time that really just represents something that is really authentic to me and something that means a lot to me.
Yeah. So you are doing a lot of rebuilding, and you've done it here in Shanghai. You found the company Inward Living, which aims to provide platforms for health, mental health and well-being. So can you tell us what led you to this field of mental health?
Yeah. So yeah, I think unconsciously I've always struggled a lot. I think, with what I now know as, like mental health struggles. So I think when I was younger, it always kind of felt like I was a very emotional person. So I felt like, okay, things like very deeply, when I get upset, I feel them a lot. It always felt like I feel them a lot than other people, or sometimes I react in ways that seem a lot more dramatic, than other people. So, when I was younger and I was in relationships, like, with breakups or things like that, it kind of like feel like I would hit rock bottom, or I'd just have this overwhelming sense of like grief or pain. Whereas it felt like sometimes I'd observe friends and they were able to handle more kind of rationally or logically. So I always knew that I was a very emotional person, and it wasn't something that I kind of liked about myself. And I have ups and downs. I had a tendency to be in very unhealthy relationships, or a few which ended up being, quite abusive or emotionally abusive. So I never really, I think I never really like had a very strong sense of, I think, like stability, if that's a good word to say. I always felt like, I was very up, very kind of like down. And when I was very happy, I was always kind of expecting the worst to happen. But I mean, I've had generally like a really great life. But I guess, what led me to start Inward Living was when I was 31. So only 3 years ago, there was a lot happening kind of in the media around like Me Too, and I used to kind of like see those videos and like they would make me quite angry for some reason. So never really understood it, but I always kind of felt like, not that I was like anti-feminist, but I was like, oh, like the way that they're talking sounds so aggressive and so angry. And, it always made me really uncomfortable, but I didn't really understand why. And one day I was just having like a chat with a girlfriend, and we're just talking, and I was having some wine, and, we started talking about, Me Too and all these stories which were coming out. And after a few drinks, I think I ended up, opening up a bit about, the fact that I had some of my own experiences when I was around 19, and talking in a little more depth than that. And after that conversation, I felt fine, but just progressively over a 2-week period, I just got really, really depressed, which is something that I really hadn't felt for a long time, since I was 19 years old. And it got so bad to the point where, I wasn't getting out of bed, and I was really struggling with suicidal thoughts. And I wasn't able to kind of figure out why. I felt like work was okay. I felt like my relationship was okay. But I just felt like so crap. And it got to the point where I was like, okay, like I need to get some help. I was like, I need to go to like rehab, or I need to go something. I didn't know why. I just knew like, it's not normal to be so suicidal. It's not normal to have these thoughts constantly. And I mean, there's a lot more to it, but essentially I ended up going back to Australia for trauma therapy. And because I am an Australian citizen, the government is really amazing. They have mental health programs. So essentially, I didn't have to pay anything out of pocket. And I was able to, get help for what I was going through. And, it kind of just made me realize how many people in Shanghai don't have the resources like that. There's some instances where, at hospitals, it costs upwards of 2,000 to 4,000 RMB for an hour session. And I mean, like for a lot of people who need it, I mean, they don't have the resources to pay for that. So, with inward living, a big part of it was kind of wanting to fundraise and give people, I think, the opportunity that I had, but also to, I think, raise awareness. And I do want to, I think, talk in a little bit more detail about, I guess, some of the experiences, but essentially just in a nutshell, I realized that, I had experiences of sexual trauma when I was 19, and I pretty much, after they happened, they had, they just built this sense of shame within me that got kind of really, I attached it to who I was as a person, and I buried those emotions down deep. And I realized at that moment, and part of my therapy was like the first time I think I actually started really grieving, not so much what happened to me, but just that I realized like, like things happened to me, but I buried them down so deep inside that essentially, until that breakdown I had 11 years later, I kind of felt like, wow, like, look at all the things you've gone through since then, that not that they were unrelated, but they were almost self-inflicted. They were almost just me running from, those experiences that happened that I was ashamed of. Because of them, I did so many things to myself. I struggled with an eating disorder for nearly 10 years. I allowed myself to be in all these relationships which were really dysfunctional. I hurt people myself because I was so hurt, and, I was just running and running and running away. And I just felt like, if I was able to have not felt that shame, 11 years ago, who would I be, or how would it be different? Would I have been able to kind of save myself a lot of that pain? And I think that's what body does, right? When we do things or when we experience things that hurt us or feel shameful, our natural reaction is to not tell anybody, and we distract ourselves, or we numb ourselves, or we deny, or we look at ways outside of ourselves to avoid what we're feeling. And I think it's amazing for a lot of people, it takes such a long time. So I think that was the biggest sense of grief for me. It was just grieving the last 11 years of my life at that moment.
Were you aware when you were developing these unhealthy habits? Were you aware that it was because of the traumatic experience that you had when you were 19? Like you said, you developed an eating disorder. Did you think those two were connected in any way?
I don't think so. Like it sounds really weird, but I remember, after the experiences of, sexual trauma that I had, and they were over a period of time, I think very distinctly, I think a period of like 6 months. I started getting like really, really depressed. And it was just something that I really didn't feel like I could speak to anyone about, and I didn't speak to anyone about it. The one time that I did talk to someone, before 31, so at 19 was, Lifeline. So I actually had called Lifeline. It sounds corny, but, you just see these like ads on TV and you're like, okay, maybe I can do that. And, I remember because I was really depressed, and I called them and I said my name was Sarah, and it happened. very truthfully. And I remember the lady just saying, what are you going to do, or what are we going to do? And I mean, she didn't really give me a solution, but I think she at least made me feel like, okay, shit, like this is something really like bad has happened. But she said to me after, you need to like forgive yourself. She just kept saying to me over and over again, like, you need to forgive yourself. Like, this isn't your fault. And I think that gave me a tremendous amount of courage. And I remember after that, I think it was probably after a period of 6 months where I had been so depressed, and, I had gained a decent amount of weight, like maybe 10 or 12 kilograms, because I basically hadn't been, really sleeping for 6 months. I'd been like, I'd just stay up really late, because I would have these really emotional kind of like outbursts by myself, or I'd have kind of like these flashbacks. So I started just, watching TV really late and eating junk food. And, I think people started to notice I was gaining a little bit of weight, but obviously they had no idea what was going on. So it was the first time in my life, where I felt like anyone had ever noticed me because of my weight. And then on top of that, I was feeling pretty terrible just in general. So, but sorry, after I had that call with Lifeline, I remember, going into the backyard, and I kind of had collected these clothes and things that had reminded me of these incidents. And, I kind of burnt them in my backyard. It was kind of like this weird ceremony that I did for myself. And I told myself, like, that's it. Like, I'm done. Like, I'm done feeling this way. I'm done, like, allowing these experiences to kind of take over me. So I kind of like almost like a ceremony to say goodbye, like this part of me is like dead. I'm just going to focus on not remembering and pretending it never happened, essentially. So that's what I did. And I learned, like, when I had these flashbacks, to kind of like shake them off. Whenever they came, I'd just like, almost shake my head or do whatever I could to kind of just stop thinking about them. And then actually, I mean, it worked over time, but, so I really buried it deep down. And I think in many ways I was able to forget about it over a couple of years. But, essentially what happened afterwards is I think it came out in all these other ways. So, first was kind of like the eating disorder. So I remember, like feeling, really crap about my body, about myself, but thinking like, okay, I can control these types of things. I'm going to, because I feel in some ways so disgusting and broken on the inside, I'm going to work on my outside, and that's going to make me feel better. So I went on kind of like a trip to Egypt. I was in Egypt for a few months. And I remember just, looking up all these things about like weight loss and just being obsessive with losing weight, and I had this idea that like, okay, like once I look a certain way, everything's going to be better. I'm going to be really desirable. I'm going to be really attractive. Like all these feelings I have are going to go away. And, so it started with like anorexia, for a few months, and I lost a lot of the weight, and, people started to notice and complimented me, and it kind of ended up just feeding this new version of self-confidence I had, so I don't know, like there wasn't, I guess in some ways subconsciously I knew it was connected, but it didn't, I had just decided to bury it so far down. It was just my new kind of, I don't know if safety blanket is the right word, but it kind of gave me a sense of like control over my life, like, or being able to control the narrative in some way, whether that was just through my appearance.
So can you tell us like a little bit about at what point did you start to feel like this was becoming a little bit maybe dangerous, or did anybody of your friends or family notice this and like try to talk to you about it? How did that sort of pan out?
Yeah. I think, I always knew it was very healthy. So I don't think there was a moment I was, I almost want to say like building this eating disorder. I think the point where it slipped, where it went from like, okay, I'm going to try and lose this weight that I've gained during this period of being depressed and reach my ideal weight, like that it slips between there and then becoming like a full-blown like eating disorder that you can't switch off. It was very blurry. I can't remember. It just kind of like happened. And that's why eating disorders are so dangerous. But at anorexia, there would be days, like sometimes I think the longest stretch I went for was like 7 days where I didn't eat. And I was pretty much, lying in bed because I just didn't have energy to do anything, or I felt so sick. And I think because I was starving myself so much, that eventually backlashed and it turned into bulimia, where, I would binge, incredibly large amounts of food and then purge afterwards to make up for it. And when I did have bulimia, my weight, I was never extremely underweight. I think there was like a very short period of time where I was very skinny. After that, it's like attained a relatively like healthy weight on the outside. Even had very severe bulimia where I was, throwing up 5 or 7 times a day. So I think because of that, people on the outside, it's not always an eating disorder you can see, unless you physically like see the person throwing up or you've had experience. So, I never really like had that. I think maybe a lot later, like maybe 3 or 4 years later, I reached out to a volunteer organisation in Australia called the Butterfly Foundation, or Eating Disorder Victoria, which is the state where I lived. And I went to like a support group or two, and I remember going to see a psychologist first time. And I think that was mainly because anyone had pulled up anything, but I was a bit scared. I was a bit worried about what it was doing to my health. And I'd gone to see a psychologist and, I think within like 2 minutes of talking, she already started telling me kind of what was wrong with me. Like you don't want to be fat, you're scared, you think food bad, and first experience having ever seen a therapist. And I just felt completely like unheard. And because of that, I never went back. So, yeah, but eventually I did work on it, but a lot of it was through kind of educating myself a lot around nutrition.
So with these eating disorders, it did affect your life. What about your relationships after the traumatic experience after 19? How were your relationships with your romantic relationships, I guess?
Or even just trust in relationships.
Yeah, just trust in general, I guess. Did it change for you?
Yeah, gosh. It's weird. Like I always say, when I think of like 19, I think in my own sense, I always felt like but I have a cousin who's in her early 20s now. And when I actually went back to Australia to do a lot of this, therapy, my cousin at the time was around. So I think like when I saw her, that kind of really made me realize like, wow, like 19 is very young, like we don't have like an immense amount of maturity at that age. I always say like I don't really remember how I felt or the type of person I was, what it felt like before I had my eating disorder, which in many ways I think means before I had the sexual trauma. I don't remember what that feels like, but since I can remember, I guess, which was after the things happened. I've just always like been really, you know, desperate to be in like a relationship, you know, desperate in the sense of like just wanting to, I've always had a sense of wanting to like find my forever person. And I understand now, I think, having hindsight and having been through therapy, that, you know, I just had this deep like need to feel loved and to feel like worthy and to feel special, because I just had that hole inside of me, you know, that I couldn't fill. You know, I spoke a bit about, you know, being or like growing up in a Chinese culture, and a lot of the messaging, you know, what it meant to be a respectable woman, to be a desirable woman. And a lot of that messaging was, you know, you don't sleep with a lot of people. You should be respectable. You're not very promiscuous. A lot of these kind of really, I guess, old school kind of views of what it's like to be, you know, a respectable woman. You know, so I think the things that had happened, or the sexual trauma that had happened, some of the instances, you know, even though I was 19 at the time, some of those things were, some of the men were maybe like more than twice my age, maybe in their 50s or 60s. And, you know, it was a really like disgusting thing for me to process, you know, at that age. So I think, you know, so much of that just went against that hope, I guess, that I felt like that I could ever be a person that, you know, people or that men found to be respectful, right? So, you know, I think the way that it shaped me, turned myself, or I put so much effort, not only in my appearance, but everything was the opposite of how I was feeling. So, you know, being really agreeable, being really domesticated, you know, not having aggressive ends, not like in relation. You know, I think essentially my identity after that I formed was just like, what would the perfect woman be like? You know, which is very different from what I think these days. But back then I thought it's like, okay, like, how do I become this perfect woman who's attractive and nice and agreeable and pleasant? Core words, you know, the perfect wife. So in my relationships, I never really had a sense of myself. I went in like, you know, and I've always been good at reading people, as in, I think emotionally, you know, I can tell, you know, when people are happy. I can read when people are things. And even though that's a great quality that I use for much better purposes now, back then it was kind of like, okay, like, this is how I can tell this is frustrating him a bit. So this is how I need to change myself in the relationship. You know, and I think that sometimes the type of guys I attracted were guys that were very controlling and very dominating. You know, who liked, I guess, like partners who were like that, right? Who didn't really have an relationships. I really got trapped in a lot of relationships which were quite emotionally abusive, or with partners that weren't very empathetic. I guess, you know, it kind of like felt normal for me.
At that point, did you feel like that was your safety net? And what is safety to you now?
Oh, I'm not really sure. Yeah, safety net. That's a good question. Not sure. I think like when I think back, I just it felt like tunnel vision. So I feel like I was always, my aim was kind of always to like find my person, get married, you know, like have a family. So kind of fall back on these like expectations that my parents had for me, which I mentioned earlier. I feel like in some ways that kind of felt like my road to like redemption in some ways, perhaps, or my road to back to becoming like respectable, or in my mind, it was like the solution to how I was going to feel happy, find a way to be successful in my career, find someone who really loves me, build a family, and then all these things that I struggle with will disappear. So I'm not sure that it was a safety net. I mean, I think it was a way of me, I think, getting rid of the part of myself that I really didn't like. But I definitely don't. Looking back now, I don't think I ever felt safe. I think I just, that wasn't something probably that mind. And I think knowing now, what I was going through, wasn't just a eating disorder. It wasn't just then. I was going through something called complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So part of that is that, you don't have to, you're always reacting to things. So looking back now, I can see I was constantly kind of and reacting, and then, trying to calm myself down again, and then reacting. And so I don't think I ever felt safe. I think I just never wanted to stop long enough to feel anything. So I was just always kind of running and going, and, just making sure, I have someone in my life who cares about me. I have maybe work that makes me feel like validated. So I don't think I had any sense of presence. But I mean, right now, like, safety is, it's a difficult question for me now. So I have moments where, I don't feel safe. But I know a lot of that sometimes is like in my head as well. So a lot of it's more to do with like being able to trust myself, which was something that took a long time to build, feeling that like I can trust myself even if I'm put in a bad situation. I'm in tune with my gut instincts. I'm in tune with what I need. I'm not just reacting. I'm able to actively go and seek the support I need, or actively ask what I need, whether that be from, my husband or my friends or my therapist or even myself. So I think I'm sure it's different for every circumstance, but I don't know that I will ever feel like completely safe in the sense, but I think, I feel good. I feel like a lot better. So
you mentioned PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. When did you get diagnosed with PTSD?
Yeah, so my therapist now, I've been seeing her for a really long time. I started to see her, I think our conversation just had started basically where it was like, hi, nice to meet you. So basically like something bad happened, and then I have this eating disorder. So, talked about it, never went into any details, and never, we never kind of spoke about that. I just wanted help for my eating disorder. So she had, treated me or like worked with me on my bulimia, my unhealthy relationship with food, and then eventually sometimes my relationships and things like that. But I think that piece was never really addressed. I think it was when I had that breakdown a few years ago, and I was looking at like rehab. It was really weird. I kind of like felt like I just needed to disappear and go somewhere where, there would be people watching me like 24 hours a day and, to help me out of like suicidal slump that I was in. And like I said, I didn't know what I needed help for. So I was researching a lot, and I was looking up, different facilities in kind of like the US and in different areas. So it wasn't like super apparent to me that the sexual trauma had anything to do with how I was feeling during that 2 weeks. But I thought, okay, look, I've had an eating disorder for how many years? You know, even though I feel like it's okay, like perhaps it's like left some kind of like chemical like imbalance or something that, you know, I felt a bit like maybe I messed something up because I had an eating disorder so long and that's what's causing it. So I definitely looked up like a few rehabilitation centers or recovery centers for eating disorders, to various ones. And, you know, there was this one lady that I was speaking to for an inpatient program. And I was talking to her about why and how I was feeling. And she was asking me, you know, okay, like how, you know, do you still have symptoms of bulimia? Are you still throwing up? Like, have you not been eating? And I mean, I hadn't had those for quite a few years already. And she kind of had told me like, okay, you're not really like suitable for this program. The people coming into this inpatient program, you know, they need someone to watch them eat, or they need to be fed via tubes. You know, they're not, whereas for you, you don't have these issues with eating anymore. You know, but it was really amazing. She was speaking to me and she started asking me other questions, like, can you tell me a bit about, you know, your history? Like, you know, what are your emotions like? You know, can you tell me like your history of relationships? Like, you know, and I think one thing she asked me was like, have you ever experienced anything to do with like sexual trauma or anything like this? And that, I mean, I think, you know, I don't know her, I only spoke to her that one time. You know, she sent me some information and, you know, kind of had brought my attention to, I guess, the fact that eating disorders and sexual trauma very often go like hand in hand. And I feel like she maybe had a good sense objectively by, I guess, talking to me about, you know, different struggles I was having, you know, from, you know, being in an abusive relationship and, you know, the emotional ups and downs I kind of had. And she sent me some information on something called like complex PTSD. Online Googling or searching like about bipolar disorder, or about like borderline personality disorder, about, you know, a lot of different things. And I always felt this one criteria, but nothing else feels like me. So when I saw this list of symptoms for complex PTSD, it started to like tick off like basically every single box from since I was 19, you know, whether it be the eating disorders or the relationships, or, you know, like the way that I interacted with people, or trust issues, and the way that, you know, I would hurt myself, or flashbacks. You know, it kind of like felt like the first time it kind of fit in really well. So I was able to, I guess, take this information and discuss it with my therapist in Australia. It just, I think like there just wasn't many places in the world which had, I think there was a place in Florida and the other one was maybe in Europe that had, you know, realized in sexual trauma. And there were, I think it was like 50,000 USD for a month or something. But so my therapist was really amazing and she cleared basically as much of her schedule as she could. And I went back to Australia and I was able to do therapy with her. So a lot of therapy, which was called like EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And that was really, really helpful.
Was that more to address the eating disorder, or was that to address the post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yeah, so I think it was more like you know, I remember going back and saying like, look into this psychiatrist from this intake, and she's given me this information and said like, it sounds like this could be something that's very relevant to you. You know, and then talking with my therapist and my therapist saying, you know, like, okay, this makes a lot of sense. You know, we never talked about these things that happened to you. And it makes a lot of sense now, maybe a lot of the things that you've been going through. So then it was a lot more focused on like, okay. And at that time I was like, okay, I'm ready. You know, I'm ready to look at this and I'm ready to kind of open Dora's box, I guess, and to look at these things that I've suppressed for a really long time. And I think a lot of that was, you know, out of the place of inspiration, I guess, you know, but I mean, it was a blessing. So that was the first time I did. Yeah, the EMDR, it was really focused on trying to reprocess, in a way where they don't, they aren't able to be processed in a healthy way. And that resulted, I guess, in me just attaching, I guess, like this shame to my identity, which I deeply rooted in just a lot of the ways, I seek to kind of cut off, or, the relationships I was in, the unhealthy behaviors I had. So it was kind of going back and let's treat the root issue now that we know what it is, or now that I have an awareness.
Earlier, you were talking about how eating disorders is often connected to sexual trauma. Is it something that is almost always linked to something, some form of trauma, or can it be something that is like non-triggered?
Yeah, I think in a lot of instances it can be linked to trauma, but it most definitely isn't always. So, a lot of people develop eating disorders because of, societal pressure, because of different, expectations. Because of personality type as well. So a lot of people who struggle with perfectionism are at higher risk of developing eating disorders as well. But I think a lot of the times it can kind of be a coping mechanism. But yeah, it's definitely not in all cases linked to trauma. So I think there are a lot of kind of quite unique circumstances that surround, what leads someone to develop an eating disorder. So I think trauma, having a history of trauma, having PTSD increases a person's risk, but it definitely isn't the only factor. So a lot of people who perhaps have intention of dieting, or restricting calories sometimes, sometimes can indirectly or unintentionally develop an eating disorder as well. But also I think disordered eating looks very different. So it's also not just anorexia or bulimia. It can be a mix of both, or it can be a mix of like various, so there's definitely a lot of different variants. So it's really important that people do talk to a mental health professional about their individual situation.
Yeah, and it seems like you have already started your healing. You've made so much more progress, but I want to know to like what extent have you healed? Have you moved on from your experience, that traumatic experience?
Yeah, I think this is a conversation I have with, I think, a lot of people that I speak to who have been through things that have been, quite traumatic for them, or really difficult experiences. And, a question I get asked a lot is like, when do you heal, or what's the light at the end of the tunnel? Or, I think as a society, sometimes we have this idea of when it comes to mental health or struggles that we have, that healing, mean like something never happened. And I do feel like that's a really dangerous kind of stereotype or misunderstanding to have. So, I think so many of us try to deal with trauma, or try to deal with experiences we find shameful, by, trying to just like remove that very specific piece out of our lives. Or so much of it is more about kind of self-compassion and self-love. So I think the whole reason why trauma has such an effect on people is because of the shame it carries with it, of around these experiences, because we are unable to look at them. They're tolerable, they're overwhelming. We get so overwhelmed that we do anything that we can to not have to look at them, when that's kind of exactly the thing that we need to be able to begin that recovery process, or that healing process. So right. I think healing for me has been being able to, instead of looking through a lens of shame and this is who I am, this experience means something about who I am. It means that I'm dirty or that I'm disgusting or that I'm broken, leaving behind that mindset and being able to look at it as, this is something that happened to me, or, unfortunately, it's very sad, there's a lot of consequences that have happened because of those experiences. But instead of just trying to forget that it happened, going back and, working on okay, this happened, but it's an experience. It's not a part of who I am. It doesn't mean anything about who I am as a person, and kind of giving up, I think letting go of that power it has over you, define you. I think forgiveness, not necessarily like forgiving the people who have hurt us or kind of what happened, but kind of, like forgiveness in the sense of like, okay, I need to forgive myself. Maybe I need to kind of let it go. And it doesn't mean that I'm okay with what happened. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't affect me. It just means that there's kind of, like there's more to my life and there's more positive things I want to do than to let this control me. And, instead of denying it, I'm going to acknowledge that, I have PTSD. I've had an eating disorder. These are things that are maybe a part of the rest of my life, but I keep working on them. And I think the experiences, I haven't, to be honest, it's like I haven't fully taken a look at everything that happened. I did the therapy and, for some reason after a few sessions, like my brain just didn't want to focus on it anymore. It kind of wanted to move on to like, relationships and other things. So it was kind of telling me, I've had enough. And so I think healing is accepting, that there's ups and downs, but I think learning to manage like symptoms, learning to alleviate symptoms, accepting that they're, a unique part of who you are. And also learning, I'm really happy with the person I am today. And, if I wouldn't wish the things that I've been through on anyone, and I would not sign up to go through them again. No way. But, them, I wouldn't have, I think, the empathy that I have. I wouldn't have the desire I have to kind of, validate other people for their experiences and be able to relate to other people for what they're going through. So my eating disorder, it was horrible, but it did give me the gift of being able to really understand when other people going through the same thing are speaking about what they're feeling. I really understand because I've been there. Same thing with sexual trauma or, not loving yourself or being in an abusive relationship. I'm able to kind of understand and empathize with where they're coming from. So I think, that's why in my work, I'm interested in certain areas, feel authentic. I don't really know what I'd be doing otherwise, or I don't feel like I could speak up otherwise in this space. So
I wanted to follow up from a point you were saying earlier about how for you it was really important to be sort of to get into the nitty-gritty details maybe of some of the trauma that happened to you, to be able to heal from it, accept it, and sort of work towards moving away from it. Do you believe that that's true for everyone? Do you think everyone should be unpacking their trauma to be able to recover and heal? Or, because our body's natural instinct is to lock it down, put it away and forget about, the trauma. Do you think that there are instances or cases where it actually is better not to go into the depth of the trauma that you experience?
Yeah, I think once again, that's such a kind of unique question and unique for every single individual. I think it really depends on like what your day-to-day life is. So, if your trauma is so unique to a person, so it's completely relative. So for some people, or for maybe like a a person, being humiliated, maybe, having something exposed about yourself in front of colleagues or peers, that can be very traumatic. For someone, crash or losing a loved one can be distressing but not traumatic. So it's all of the individual's reaction. So for some people, they trauma doesn't have the same, in people. I think, biologically, maybe the families that they've grown up with, maybe emotionally, if they have illness or different circumstances, able to deal with difficult experiences, perhaps, trauma doesn't have the same hold on them and they're able to process it quite differently, or, they're able to cope in healthy ways. For some individuals, maybe they're not able to do that. And, so I think it plays out so uniquely. So it's really, I think trauma is just so non-comparable. Sexual trauma might mean, being touched, even just on your shoulder or part of your body. It might be verbal, it might be having someone text you. That might be very stressing for someone. For other people, it might be more physical. For other people, it might be, ongoing as well. So, but if people are happy, if they're not experiencing in their day-to-day lives, I think that comes down to like how much of your day-to-day life is being disrupted. Someone who's not back, someone who doesn't have, disordered eating, someone who is able to have functionships, and maybe just has, issues with maybe like anger or maybe like wants to develop their voice more or themselves more, like someone like that. If they don't feel the need, maybe they don't need to, whereas for others, maybe it is more deep and ingrained. So I think once again, it's so specific to the need and to how much it's disrupting your life.
So when you had your traumatic experience and when you started to seek therapy, there was a pretty big gap, right? You said at 25 is when you started seeking therapy?
Yeah, so I think around 25-ish. Maybe even a little bit earlier than that. I started seeking therapy for my eating disorder. Right. So for the sexual trauma, I was about 31 years old. So it was pretty good. That was a gap of about 11 years.
Do you think it can ever be too late for therapy? Is it ever too late? Can that window just get too wide and therapy no longer works? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I never kind of never want to like Darth Vader, like darkness, like there's no hope, but so I feel like I'm an eternal like optimist in that way, that I think the main thing is like whether or not you're open to it. But I think that there's always a place, and it's not just therapy, it's not always a therapist. Sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's a counselor. And I think when you get into specifics, there's so many types of therapists, right? Some people have to take medication, but I think it's really about finding the right person. So finding the person with the right experience for your situation, finding someone who you feel up to, that you feel understands you, and I think reminding people to be patient with this, it can take a really long time, and it can take you meeting therapists before you find the right one. But when you do find the right one, it's amazing, like when you're able to open up the progress that you can make. And it's so important to be patient. I don't think it's ever too late to try, I think, and I always think it can help. But most definitely, as we age, I think, or the longer we have certain ingrained thought patterns, it definitely becomes more difficult, because they can't become more animated. So just as you think, like, even if we don't talk about mental health and we talk about, some bad habits perhaps that we have, maybe around like lifestyle choices. I think everybody knows how difficult it is to change a lifestyle behavior. And I think it can be quite similar, for mental health as well. A lot of it is around like patterns, and these patterns become more ingrained. So the earlier someone gets help, the easier it is. And it's not always easy, but I think the better chances you have of recovering or improving symptoms. So I think the earlier the better. But also not just that, I think it's a two-way. A therapist can only help so much, but you have to be really willing to be open, yourself, and to remember that it is a confidential space and what you say isn't going to be told to anyone, right? Really having trust in that process. So I definitely I don't think it's ever too late. I think that once again, the earlier, the better, or maybe you have to deal with earlier that you're able to kind of get help. But I think everyone should try. Everyone is worth trying.
What would present day Lorraine, if you can hypothetically go to Lorraine at 19, what message would you give her?
That's gosh, that's so like such a hard thing, but it's I feel like I always ask people that as well. I kind of like have no idea. I mean, I think if it was like my daughter or my cousin or whatever that was like 19-year-old Lorraine, it's that your experiences don't define you. It's okay that things like really suck right now, but I think, seek out and like get help, and the right people aren't going to think badly of you, and if this is kind of in your own head, in our own head. There are people that will be there for you, and even though this experience is hard right now, it's going to be something that really builds your character and something that really builds, your heart. And I think that it's okay. It's not something you have to be ashamed of, and it's not something that you have to deal with yourself. You're not supposed to deal with something like this. No one is supposed to be able to handle something like this. It's it's very important to get professional help.
Yeah, I really like that. And I feel like this is a message that can be even sort of spread to our listeners listening to this, who might be going through anything of any nature, actually, similar or not, that sort of reaching out to someone is the first step towards recovery. And, if you don't like looking around to find someone you trust and you respect and feel comfortable with, as opposed to if seeking a therapist at the moment is difficult or unreachable, then, just reaching out to someone within your circle that you trust is that very, very first step that you can take to recover, really.
So, Lorraine, where can our listeners find you?
Yeah, so we've got, for people, I think, in China or Shanghai, there's an Inward WeChat page. So the WeChat ID is Inward Living, so INWARD LVING. And then if they go onto that website, there's a lot of information on whether they need kind of, to talk to someone. They want to talk to me about, confidentially about what they're going through, and maybe where they're able to get support. So whether it be a referral to the right therapist or psychologist or support groups, and also subsidized counseling as well. We have that. And then there's also links and information for organizations like Lifeline and the Community Center Shanghai, as well as like my personal contact there as well. So people are really welcome to kind of check that out and to get in touch if they feel like it's helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great. Would they be able to find the online classes there too?
In the future. So I think that will be more on like a website portal. But yeah, I think if they definitely follow that account, anything new that comes out, I'll definitely update.
Yeah, listeners, we will link all of that stuff in the description. Lorraine, thank you so much. Thank you for being so vulnerable, and thank you for sharing your story with us. You are amazing.
Yeah, you've touched my heart and all our listeners too. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow or subscribe. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please give us feedback by rating and reviewing on any of our different platforms listed in the description.
We'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and courageous enough to share their life experiences with the rest of the world. We appreciate your perspective. Thank you for showing us we are human. We would like to give a special thanks to our producer, videographer, sound engineer, and everything else in between, Joe Mills. The show would be nothing without you. I'm Joseph.
And I'm Jenica.
And we are Multispective.